All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part two of political economy. For the first part of this unit, we went ahead and we talked about mass incarceration, policing, the war on drugs, various parts of these policies, and I made the argument that they fall into the space of political economy because they are major political policies that impact huge areas of economic kind of well-being, whether that's drugs and the drug trade, whether that's the amount of labor that is done within prisons, and then the kind of economic benefits to corporations and such that use prison labor, or even the government. Every license plate that we drive, or every license plate on every car we drive is made by someone who was incarcerated. And that labor is therefore free. So that's a huge expense that, people don't have to pay. These have economic real ramifications. Of course, also then forget for the people who get out, the economic ramifications as far as not being able to easily get a job or housing or whatnot. And so that is why that falls into the realm of political economy. We're going to go into another space with that today, which is the space of immigration. I'll go ahead and bring up these slides at this point. So there we go, slideshow, immigration. And before we dive in, I just want to kind of mention a few things to really get us started. And that is, what are we trying to do with this unit? And so the first thing is, I emphasize many times that this class is all about discernment. I'm not trying to teach you all, which leader is better or not, which party to vote for, anything like that. That is not really the way that scholars engage in the realm of politics, or in the realm of policy for that matter. We'll get into the distinction shortly. What I want to teach you all is the ability to have discernment, to be able to understand the issues, the questions that are being asked within the realms of what is politics and everything that's touched by politics. The short answer is everything is touched by politics. And to be able to understand the ways that those pieces interlock, the way that those touch each other, and the way that they have ramifications that we don't always see. And finally, to be able to kind of look past the BS, the political games that all the parties play on all sides, to be able to just understand the core issues. So when we talk about immigration, this question of discernment becomes really important because immigration is one of the most hot button issues within American politics in a way that actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense from any kind of scholarly point of view. The ways that people code and discuss immigration, just the capital D discourse is located over here, and the actual kind of facts of what's happening are located over here. And that distortion really does an injustice to anyone's understanding if you just look at the news, or if you look, right, left, news doesn't matter. If you look at social media, whatever it might be, you're going to get not at all a clear image of what the question of immigration is. And so that is really the goal of this lecture, is to help with that discernment and presenting the questions as they should be, and leaving to you the information to decide what is going on. Now, I asked to you, second bullet point, why do you think immigration is such a hot button issue? And really, this is where the disadvantage of the online medium obviously comes in, because I would love to be able to do a call and response and have people say their answers. I won't be able to hear your answers, obviously, because this is a recording, but I will still ask you to pause the video, think to yourself for a couple minutes, and try to put it up as to, what is the reason that immigration is such a big deal? Why do people care so much? Okay. Some people might say, well, it's a question of legality, who should come in and who shouldn't. Some people might say it's a question of economy and jobs and access to kind of limited resources. Some people may say, in fact, that it's like a question of human rights and humanitarian benefits and kind of letting people in who need to flee from problematic situations elsewhere. Some may say that it shouldn't be an issue at all and everyone should just come in. I would say that each and every one of these is a response to a symptom of the problem. In other words, if you had COVID, the symptom of COVID is that you have body aches, or that you have a fever, or that you have major fatigue or whatever it might be. But your problem is not that. Your problem is that you have the virus of COVID-19 in your system. And these types of responses that I mentioned very much fall into a similar bucket. The biggest question with immigration is that there is a fear game being played about the idea of people coming in. Very rarely is that fear game ever accurate. And that is, not the case just recently. That's been the case since as far back as hundreds of years ago, and definitely as long as the United States has existed. But even beforehand, all the kind of terms that we use from, the ancient Greeks called them barbaroi. In South Asia, they were called pariah. There was kind of words for migrants as like threatening, as evil or demeaning or whatnot, and governments would use that as a source of legitimacy for a long, long time, ever since the idea of a state, lowercase s, has basically been a thing. So it is a fear-based emotional response. Emotional doesn't make it illegitimate. In fact, it's very legitimate. A lot of our important policies on this issue are based on that emotional reaction. Um, so we want to move away from that idea of rational as good and emotional as bad, but simply understand that it is an emotional response that is very easily played upon and distorted with what are usually objectively untruths. And that's by all sides of the political sphere. We'll get into exactly how and why. But the core issue is that people are afraid of admitting that migration is a constant, inevitable reality of our life as living beings. And therefore, there's a threat response that comes about. And that leads to some really interesting kind of contradictions. And everything else comes out of that, whether people should be illegal or illegal as a dichotomy, a kind of binary one or zero categorization that's used to say, well, certain types of migration we're fine with and certain types we're not, again, stems from that fear response. The idea of, well, it's a human rights issue. So if you're fleeing from something, then you can come in. And if you're not, then you can't. Again, comes from that fear response. How legitimate is that fear that you're running from as a kind of weaponization tool to say only certain people can come in or not? Another tool in that toolbox to kind of cover up and justify that, at the end of the day, we are afraid. We are afraid of difference. We are afraid of kind of that basic idea that people are coming to take finite resources. How finite are those resources? Not very, but there's a innate fear in there, and so on and so forth. So it all kind of stems from there. Politics versus policy. So what is political is everything that interacts with the state and power. That is what the definition of political is. And at the end of the day, the state is everywhere and in everything that we do in some way or another, from the food that you eat to the water that you drink. The reason that it's safe and it doesn't have cholera, the state. The reason that it is not safe and has lead in it in Detroit and Flint, the state. And so on and so forth. So the politics is, or the political is everywhere. Politics is the kind of day-to-day minutia of which leader is going to be in power, electoral nonsense, the kind of debates in Congress between different folks, which person is in with the party, which person is out. All of that is politics, is kind of the noise around the state, especially in democratic politics. But even in the authoritarian states, then you have, who's friends with Vladimir Putin or whatnot, and who did he assassinate and who did he exile and so on. So there's still politics. The Game of Thrones, for people who may know the TV show. Policy is the actual things that the state does, and the actual kind of laws, practices, policy. Policy is in the idea, but is the physical ways that the state defines and exercises its power. And so policy actually becomes significantly more important to follow than politics. And many times in politics, certain leaders will say certain things and then enact policy that is quite the opposite. And that is the case on both sides of the aisle in ways that we will see with immigration. But in other ways, When we talk about, say, people generally expect democratic politicians because of their politics to be, shall we say, more in favor of racial and ethnic equality. But based on policy, let's take, for example, current presidential candidate Kamala Harris. We would expect her to be very much in that space, but we saw how civil or the law system and incarceration is extremely, extremely racially loaded. And so far it goes so far as for Michelle Alexander to call it the new Jim Crow, and Kamala Harris was previously the Attorney General, the main prosecutor for the state of California, trying to her job was to send people to prison. And so the politics of what she says and the policy of what she did in that space are not aligned. That's not just for her. That's not saying that I'm for or against her in any way, shape, or form, but simply to kind of demonstrate the example with a relevant current choice. I can name just as many ways in which Donald Trump is, the opposite, and I won't get into that here, but just to demonstrate the difference between politics and policy. Similarly, objective versus neutral, very important as we delve into these spaces with political economy, with the kind of current tensions and issues, and ways in which our state, struggles and could improve. These are not to say that I'm particularly trying to convince you all to be like America haters or something like that, but that I do believe it is extremely important to learn to live in the country that you live in for what it is and, work to understand that and understand those challenges and ways that they may or may not be better. I don't believe simply that because these challenges exist that they can't be otherwise. For example, not within 40 years ago, could my parents be married because they're in an interracial marriage, and could most of us be, attending school because of the color of our skin, for example. Like these things do change. So when I present challenges to you all, I believe to present these challenges because they are important to know, again, that quality of discernment, and not because I'm trying to, make you all like hate the country that you live in or something like that. Whether you do or not is your choice. What you do with that information is not my prerogative, but I want you all to have the information because the information is critical to, your functioning as someone who does live in this country and this society. And I could, I study international politics, so I could list you all the terrible things that pretty much every country on the planet has done, and it will be a laundry list, similarly long. So, if this was international politics class, we'd talk about settler colonialism in Japan, and we would talk about kind of occupation of and linguistic erasure in China. We would talk about the ongoing kind of attempted genocide of Muslims in India. Like we would go through these things. But this is American politics class, so that is not something that we will be doing. Um, but what is objective and what is neutral remains important no matter what. Because there is this tendency in instruction these days to try to conflate these two and say they are the same thing, especially as American politics, as we talked about a couple lectures ago, has gotten more polarized. There's this view that to be an effective educator, you must always be objective and neutral. And my argument here is that there isn't really often a way to be both. In fact, the two are in many ways polar opposites of each other. And why is that? Well, objectivity is seen as to present information with as little bias as possible, correct? And then neutrality is the conscious biasing of information to the middle. And therefore, if objectivity is to exist without bias and neutrality inherently requires biasing to the middle, there's very little space in which the two can actually interact and intersect effectively. For example, uh, let us take content warnings with like animal cruelty or animal abuse. But let's take the story of our dog Biscuit, who you saw in one of the little blurbs recently. And he went through some really horrific animal abuse. He cannot tell us the story of all of it, but he has the injuries to prove it. That dog has been shot, that dog has had his leg broken, that dog has been shackled. That dog has had all kinds of crazy stuff happen to him like long before we ever got him. The objective reality is that he was abused and that those things that were done to him were horrific. But if we were trying to be neutral, we would say that, well, maybe he just was a bad dog. And no, he's not, but, maybe he's just a bad dog, and that should, like, is a natural way to kind of correct the behavior, but also it's pretty bad and they should find other ways to correct the behavior. Neutral. You're not condemning the person for doing the horrific things, and you're not endorsing but you're also not endorsing the person for doing those things. So you're just like, I don't know, it is and it isn't. You're doing that wishy-washy thing. Whereas the objective is it's messed up. Don't do that to an animal. Don't do that to anything. That is wrong. And so this is the examples that I give to show that they are not the same thing. In that situation, the neutral response is objectively horrific, because you should condemn that kind of, heinous act. And the objective response is very much not neutral, because you have to take a side when the reality is so clearly, slanted to one or another. So I endeavor always to give you the most objective version of events that I can, and present, the stories as they should be. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the things that I present are neutral. So with that, we will continue. A land of immigrants. This is the common refrain that we really use when we talk about the US. Everyone is from somewhere else. We are all immigrants. Hamilton took this really far in the play a few years ago when that was a fad. And they had like a whole rap about how immigrants get the job done. And on the one hand, that phrasing of America's a land of immigrants, everyone here is from elsewhere, is a truism. On the other hand, it's an erasure of the critical nature of it being a settler project. A reminder from earlier in the course that a settler project is a form of colonialism that is centered on the occupation of land and the elimination of those that are indigenous denizens of that land, to make a new home for settlers. Inherently, it requires the destruction of all other claimants to land, and it centers all its policy on land. Um, and the reason that they claim that everyone is in America is born elsewhere is an erasure is because there are those who certainly were not from elsewhere, called the, native folks. And they were from here and they had their land taken by the settlers, occupied and put on reservations. And we'll talk about in the next lecture how horrific that process was and is to this day. And that to claim that everyone is in fact an immigrant undercuts the idea that it would be more accurate to say that everyone is a settler, other than obviously the native folks, because of the fact that immigrant kind of is more morally ambiguous. You can immigrate without kind of imposing a new power system. But when you're a settler, by default, you are, imposing your own will and power system onto the land. And that is a very important distinction to make. Um, that doesn't mean you can't use this phrase, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its, truth to it, and its kind of different ways of activating certain animuses and certain emotional valences. These are big words, but basically activating certain feelings. But at the end of the day, it does have this other track record of, well, if everyone's a land of immigrants, that means that we all can be native, right? And that's kind of the goal of the settler project, is to replace the native with the settler. Um, it is, at the end of the day, what is called a national myth. And this is something that I'm doing my dissertation on, which is the idea of national myths. National myths doesn't mean that they're untrue. National myths are stories that we tell to legitimate belief in the country that we live in or the nation that we're a part of. Um, Other national myths, or some, yes, some national myths from the US include, like the text of the Statue of Liberty, this idea of the land of immigrants. Give me your tired, your poor, your broken masses, and so on, that everyone has a chance to come to the land of opportunity, the land of the free. We're all from somewhere else, and we're all going to get together and have a, utopic kumbaya and whatnot. It's a national myth. It's an ideal that we strive for. It's something that we, really want to believe is true, and it kind of, image that we paint the country with to, again, stir that belief in it. And those are good things. It unifies people. It helps you believe it's the thing to kind of push to actually achieve. Obviously, like any other national myth, we have not actually achieved it, and we probably never will 100%. We can get closer, certainly we can get a lot closer than we are now. Um, but it is, at the end of the day, a national myth. Other national myths from other countries include, say, in Japan, they talk a lot about how the national myth that it's like the kind of technological frontier of the future. They have their bullet trains and their automated toilets and all the kind of cool little gadgets and stationery and pens and like things that they have, and like every kind of unique little craftsman thing comes from there. So that's the national myth. The national myth of German engineering and like BMWs and Mercedes and whatnot as like the best of the best vehicles because like the Germans are just so good at making vehicles. National myth. The national myth of India as being a country that descends from an ancient civilization of great spiritual enlightenment and Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism and all these traditions that come out of their national myth, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean there isn't some truth to them, but they are stories that are told to legitimate kind of belief in the country. Interrogating the truth of the specific myth around the US is today's goal, and gaining that equality of discernment, like we talked about from the previous slide, within that. Which, because at the end of the day, the myth is not going to be very true. It is a story. That doesn't make us bad, it's just a story. And we talked about a little bit why it's political economy, but to be very explicit about it, immigration directly impacts things like taxation, directly impacts jobs in the job market, directly impacts the budget that the government uses to enforce immigration, and so on and so forth. There are many ways in which, and then also the labor that comes from immigration just like cascades into 10 other different things that affect economics very thoroughly. So we'll talk about all these and more as we progress. So the idea of immigration as a fear-based response is not new. It's not new to the US, it's not new to people as a whole. Since basically, the Constitution was signed in 1787, and George Washington becomes president and all of that. In 1798, the US puts its first immigration restrictions. Now, the big irony of these restrictions is they talk about how everyone's an alien, or everyone that is an alien, in other words, born outside of the United States and is not a US citizen should be subject to like various restrictions on what jobs they can get and what papers they need to get become a citizen and where they can live and so on. But the irony is that before 1787, everyone was an alien. Every single person, other than like some 11-year-olds or younger, were not born in the United States. They were born in an English colony, in other words, England. So they're all British. So there's definitely an irony to say that yes, yes, because we were here when America declared independence, we get to count as real Americans, and you all who came a couple years afterwards don't. That very much feels hypocritical to say the least. But either way, there was the first time that we had kind of these kinds of restrictions put in place, and it's notable that they put it with sedition, which is like things that you say against the state, like borderline treason by words, basically. There's definitely a conflation that the aliens are committing sedition. Were they actually? No. But it was a easy way to drum up support for a government that was new, in debt, and needing people to believe in it, which is to say the immigrants are bad, please hate them, and because we, work to fight them, you should love us because we're protecting you. Were they actually protecting them from much of anything? No. But that is the purpose of these acts most of the time, is to drum up legitimacy by stoking fear that is probably not actually accurate. Then you have the 1850s version, which is the Know Nothings. Now, the Know Nothings were very much the same folks as those who were kind of engaged in the maintenance of slavery as an institution, and eventually would become the same kind of folks who would advocate for systemic discrimination and Jim Crow and its offshoots and whatnot. But they were the types who said that, all the immigrants are also evil. Whether that's, at this time it was primarily folks from Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Spain, and other parts of kind of southern and non-England, Germany, France, Europe. Um, we just had the starts of Chinese and Japanese immigration, and the waves of kind of Mexican immigration as the U.S. incorporated parts of what became or what was Mexico, like Texas and California and Arizona and whatnot. But those were not really the issues of the day. But these folks kind of showed up and became a really kind of major political force within the Democratic and Republican parties for a long time. Again, kind of stirring up fears as tensions over slavery were exploding. One of the easy ways to curtail those fears of over slavery and kind of delay that conversation was to say, no, 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 let's not talk about the fact that we're enslaving, tens of thousands to millions of people. Let's talk about how we hate immigrants. That's actually more important right now. And that did a good job of delaying the conversation for about 10 years until the Civil War ended up happening anyway. But that was very much the kind of political attempt, the politics of the policies of the Know Nothings to limit the access to the country, have immigration freezes and, whatnot, deport folks, or the early versions of deporting folks, expelling them, and so on. And then towards the end of the 1800s and into basically around the 1930s, we had what's called the eugenics era. And the eugenics era very much stemmed from a horrific, horrific bastardization of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. This is obviously not a biology class, so not something that you need to know in depth, but just to make the point very clear, Darwin's theory of evolution does say survival of the fittest in that the fittest will survive, produce offspring, and pass on those traits. But the incorrect conflation is that survival of the fittest always means harder, better, faster, stronger from the Kanye West song, and that would be very, very wrong. Famous example, the pygmy mammoth. So everyone knows what a mammoth is. Big old elephant, hairy thing, one of the largest land animals to ever live, in the weight class of some smaller dinosaurs and so on and so forth. Um, and the mammoths, they died out after the Ice Age, mostly except for the pygmy mammoth. Some of the last mammoths on the planet to survive were actually the pygmy mammoths. Why were they pygmy? Pygmy means small, by the way. Well, that's because when the Ice Age happened, a lot of places that are islands now, like Japan and Indonesia and Malaysia and even parts of like Madagascar and whatnot, or the Mediterranean Sea, were very frozen over. There was like just ice that you could walk over to connect those to the main continents that we know today. And so the mammoths were walking around, looking for food as they are. They're very big, they need food. And then the ice would begin to melt, and eventually those passages would go away, and the mammoths on the other side would get stuck. And then when you're stuck on an island, all of a sudden there ain't that much food for a mammoth on even like the bigger islands of, say, Indonesia. And so the mammoths, and then it's getting hotter and whatnot. And so it actually became evolutionary advantageous to be smaller, to need less food, and there were less big things that were going to come try to eat you, which was the main purpose to be big and beefy in the first place, because you're on an island. They can't be that big either. And so until, relatively a few thousand years ago, we had pygmy mammoths long after the big woolly mammoth died out, even though the pygmy mammoth was more fit for that environment, even though it was technically smaller, weaker, less powerful, and all of those things. Um, Eugenics is the very racially loaded belief that certain groups of people are evolutionarily superior because they misconstrue Darwin's theory to mean that, being fit means harder, better, faster, stronger. There's also very much the belief in here that humans are of different species, which is completely incorrect. We are all the same species. There is very, very little genetic difference between folks of any racial group. There is, the famous idea that's often given is you are just as kind of biologically or genetically different from someone in your same racial group from the other side of the continent as you are from someone from a different racial group. So say like a Japanese person and a Vietnamese person are about as different from each other as a Japanese person and a Norwegian person. And a Senegalese and an Ethiopian are about as different from each other as that same Senegalese and a Costa Rican. In fact, the Senegalese might be closer to the Costa Rican because West African slaves were taken to Central America a long time ago and mixed with folks there. So the racial lines that are created have no meaning in any kind of scientific fact whatsoever. But the idea that they might, the incorrect kind of created idea that they might, and that therefore certain people are genetically superior, fueled a lot of this anti-immigration sentiment. Um, to preserve the nature of the white race in air quotes. Um, and guess who wasn't included in that? The Irish, the Italians, Russians, Poles, certain types of Germans, Spaniards, Portuguese, all the kind of Eastern European countries, Croats and Bosniaks and so on. Nowadays, we would consider them very white, but back then, the white race, quote unquote, had to be protected from assimilation with these, again, fear-based politics, evil and whatever it might be, immigrants. And so that type of policy or that type of politics led to a series of policies to limit immigration from all over the world, to try to keep America Anglo and German and French and whatnot. And this was not a left or right thing. Woodrow Wilson, what probably the third or fourth most famous Democratic president of all time, after like FDR, Obama, and like maybe Bill Clinton, somewhere in that range. But Woodrow Wilson is, the guy when it comes to like international law and what became the UN and all these types of things. Well, he was also a horrific racist who believed in eugenics. And he has this quote within this was a propaganda movie to like support the KKK, where he's talking about how great the KKK was and how it's going to kind of protect the white race from extinction because the immigrants are coming and whatnot. So again, politics that led to very clear policy banning a lot of these folks from coming in, like this. This would be an example of policy. This was legal and totally acceptable at that time, not just for Irish folks, but especially for Irish folks in places like Boston and New York and whatnot. So these restrictions have been a thing basically since the country began. And they are not new to the recent era. And the idea of race and kind of racial fear mongering and using racial fear mongering via immigration to gain electoral support and legitimacy are tactics as old as the country. Whether that's, the to gain legitimacy for the new country way back here, to gain legitimacy when the country's falling apart here, or to gain legitimacy when the world is falling apart and world wars are going down here. In all those cases, it comes back to, again, that core issue of immigration is an issue of fear. So what are some of those more modern policies that went down? What we have in the 1920s was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, where the racism is in the name in a sense because they called it the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it was really the Asian Exclusion Act, in that folks from all of East Asia basically were banned from coming in. Again, there was a very racist undertone of, they're gonna come in and take over, and they're so different from us, and so on, forgetting the fact that, many of the ones that were there that were used to stoke that fear mongering were there because they were brought over by the US government to build railroads and so on. And then they were like, oh shoot, why are there so many Chinese here? Well, because you brought them here, guys. And then now they turn around and exclude them. This was passed under a Democratic regime under Wilson and friends. So let's not kind of get it twisted that it's a Democrat that the Democrats are always in favor of open borders and the Republicans are against. Like both sides of the aisle have used these types of fear-mongering tactics very effectively over the course of their history. Then we have Japanese internment, which happened during World War II after the U.S. declared war on Japan. You had the very, again, racist and problematic belief that people of Japanese ancestry who were very American and American citizens and all of that, and even those that weren't, but either way, would be conspiring against the US in favor of Japan just because of their, background. And so folks of Japanese ancestry, again, American citizens in many cases, were ordered by the federal government, by a Democratic president, the probably second or third most famous, and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to pack up their stuff, take two trash bags, and that's it, no more, leave their homes, and get sent to concentration camps. That is what they were. If you ever have gone to Manzanar, which is not too far from here, we had our own concentration camps for Japanese folks just at the exact same time that we were fighting the Nazis who had their concentration camps for Jews and gays and whatnot. So when everyone tells you that, the US had never had a concentration camp, we have Native American reservations and Japanese internment camps, which both very much function and serve the exact same purpose. Now, what was so horrific about this? Well, obviously, you're sending people to a concentration camp. Enough said. But let's get even deeper. You tell them without a moment's notice, without due process, without any of those things that the Constitution is supposed to guarantee you, no trial, no nothing, just all of them based on their, race and ancestry, get out, you're going. Well, where are you going? Most Japanese folks lived in the big cities in California, so, San Francisco and adjacent, or Los Angeles and adjacent. Well, you might be going to Manzanar, not too far away. Either way, you're leaving your home, you're leaving your, friends and family, you're leaving all your stuff behind. You're leaving, your house, you're leaving your school, you're leaving your work. So it doesn't matter how close or far it is. But they might send you on a train to Arkansas. There's two of these internment camps in Arkansas. There ain't barely more than 5 people in the whole state of Arkansas, yet they found because they and then so they found space to put two internment camps out there. Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Tula Lake, which is in the middle of, basically nowhere up here, and so on and so forth, just because of your blood. And then, your house was not there most of the time when you got back after being an intern for, in the concentration camp for 4 to 5 years. Oftentimes you were forced to sell it. And then you come back and it's like, okay, cool. All that stuff that you left behind, that house that you lived in for years, that you were going to raise your family in, whatever, gone. And did you get to sell it at market rate? Hell no. You get confiscated by the government in many cases, or sold at, well below market rate, because, you're rushing to sell almost like a foreclosure. So even when you get back for having done nothing wrong, even if we want to go all carceral with the logic, there's no crime that had been done or anything like that. Even if there was, no one deserves that. But all your stuff, all the things that you might have, had, boom, lost. For those that are more interested in this story, I might recommend taking a visit to see Manzanar. It's about an hour and a half drive from Glendale. It ain't too far. Good day trip. Heavy, heavy stuff. But definitely would recommend. And the other would be Fort Minor, who famously is known for being on the Linkin Park song In the End. He's of Japanese ancestry and he released a song called Kenji, that details the story of his family going through internment and what that looked like for them. And so I might recommend hitting that song up. It is quite good. Um, Other kinds of exclusion policies we had were around the Vietnam and Korean Wars. So a lot of folks went, over to fight in the wars on behalf of the United States government, displacing a lot of people, bombing the hell out of their homes and whatnot. And then those people would eventually try to come here, to, get away from the war-torn destruction in their homes that, we kind of caused, by going to war there. And unfortunately, this is an example of a policy that is kind of de facto, not by law, though there were certainly major restrictions about how many folks could come in, how many visas were going to be given out, and so on. It was very hard. But even once you got here, the racism and prejudice against these folks because of the fact that we were at war, in their country and kind of imperial wars, over there, and they're blamed for whatever. I don't even know what they were blamed for the fact that we went and bombed the shit out of their homes. meant that finding jobs, finding homes, finding places to live, etc., was next to impossible. And so most of these populations were forced to live in little kind of um, isolated communities of their own ethnic group. That's why the city of Westminster, for example, looks the way it is no one else wanted to live amongst Vietnamese because they blamed the Vietnamese for the Vietnam War, which we started. And so this policy I bring to mind because it really shows the flaw in the logic that we have of, going back a couple slides, the land of immigrants, that everyone's going to come here and get along and it's going to be great and we're all going to have a great time and, we're so accepting and whatnot. No, we're not. We're going to say, yeah, yeah, sure, you're here. We don't like you. We don't want you here. So you're going to go kind of get isolated into this is the exact definition of the word ghetto, which is comes from Europe, especially from Europe's treatment of Jewish folks, where they were forced to live in isolated communities of their own away from the rest of people. And that's what a ghetto was. Ghettos today are still racialized for Black and Brown and certain types of Asian folks to keep them separated from, upper middle class society and so on. Obviously, we have Latin American migration, which is usually what people think of when they talk about migration within kind of the US context. We talk about this border down here. It's funny how we never talk about this border up here, and we're never talking about the illegal Canadians or anything like that. And we'll definitely be getting into this very in depth. You're watching a whole movie about the Braceros program as one of your, assignments for this week. And then we have the Iranian Revolution, where there's a whole kind of series of sanctions and migration holds put on place for folks of Iranian descent, where to come to the US, you had to basically first go to get residency from another country that isn't Iran. So Turkey and Germany were two of the big examples at that time, and spend a few years there. And then you could come to the US simply because the US and Iran were not friends, and still aren't friends, certainly. And there are many, 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 many more examples of these kinds of restriction policies that we have simply based on, identity factors. And not based on the kind of any kind of merit or whatnot. Not that those things are always actually so transparent, but these are very kind of open examples of how the policies are directly prejudiced against folks from certain places. So then we get into the topic of what is a refugee? A lot of times when people talk about immigration, they invoke this term, and it becomes a very important idea that we understand. So a refugee, as the bullet says here, this definition comes from the United Nations, the Convention on the Rights of the Refugee, which the United States is a founding kind of writer and signatory of. So we are bound by international law to observe and respect this definition and all the things that come with it. So, refugee, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, such as gender, sexual orientation, caste for South Asia, and so on, or political opinion, is outside the country of their nationality and is unable, or owing to that fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of their former habitual residence, is unable or owing to such fear unwilling to return to it. So this is kind of legalese, but it basically means someone who is persecuted for any of these various factors, left their country because of that persecution, and is unable or unwilling because of the persecution to go back to it. Whether or not they were a citizen of that country or not is irrelevant, as long as the place that they are a citizen of, or if they're not a citizen of anywhere at all, is not willing to take them. That makes you a refugee. Um, then you have asylum, which is a kind of adjacent concept of someone who flees to another country, kind of seeking protection for similar types of factors, but it's technically a different legal process because you leave or what as you're trying to leave the country, you apply for asylum and then you leave. Whereas as a refugee, you're already outside and you're asking for entrance. So you've done the fleeing, and now you want to go somewhere, you're a refugee, you want to flee and you haven't left yet, you're an asylum seeker. Oh, and I should say before I continue, let's pause the video and kind of think about this question to yourself. Who hosts the most refugees in the world? Just like by total number. Think about it. Come up with a country. What about as a portion of their population? Maybe it's not fair to compare the United States and Switzerland, considering that the United States has probably 20 or 30 times the population of Switzerland. Um, so what about as a share of their population? Who hosts the most refugees in total? Pause the video, think about a couple examples. Okay. Most of the time, when we ask this question, the answers come to, again, this is where the call and response would be lovely to have, but we don't. So I can guess some of the kind of usual suspects will get their, licks in. People are going to say the UK, the US, Canada, Norway, France, and so on and so forth. Um, let's see. So who is hosting the world's refugees? This comes from mid-2017, so the numbers are a little different. We're going to look at the numbers for today very, very shortly. Don't worry. Um, and you have the gradients and colors from, this is by total numbers, so not as a portion of population. And you have from like basically none to, over 500,000. And then you have some of the biggest ones highlighted here in the really dark red. So we have Uganda with 1.25 million folks, Pakistan with almost 1.5 million refugees, Iran with about 1 million refugees, Turkey with 3.5 million refugees, Lebanon with about 1,000 or 1 million refugees. This is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has anywhere between 2 and 3 million at a given time, until recently, where a lot of them actually had to flee to some of these other nearby countries. This is Sudan, this is Ethiopia, this is Germany. So the only country in the whole Western world, and that includes, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, China, etc., and obviously all of Europe, that has anywhere above 500,000 refugees, Germany. So good job, Germany. Round of applause to you. You're still not in the top five, by the way, but hey, at least you're trying. Lebanon is probably the size of, roughly Greater Southern California, Bakersfield to San Diego, has 1 million refugees. Um, Uganda is not much bigger, probably the size of like half the state of California, 1.5 million refugees, and so on and so forth. The US as a whole country, you know, 30, 10 times, 20 times, 30 times bigger than somewhere like Lebanon. Um, doesn't even barely hits the 100,000 mark or in that range. So most of the world's refugees are not coming to the West. But it becomes such a fear point. First off, if you're a refugee, by the definition in the previous slide, you click and go back, you are fleeing from a well-founded fear. So you're leaving for a damn good reason, in other words. And yet, when you get there, people are scared of you. Does that make any sense? Some may say, okay, yeah, but like, what about the jobs and the money and all that? We will get to that. Trust me, we will get there. But just think like their person is fleeing for their life from a war, from famine, from whatever. The reason that these refugee numbers here are so high because there is a ongoing displacement of folks in Palestine, for example, and also from Iraq, also from Syria, because of wars, that have direct relations to U.S. foreign policy. Why is the number in Iran and Pakistan so high? Because of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. And all those folks are folks that fled from the war and violence caused by that invasion. Um, and so on and so forth. Why are these numbers so high? Because of constant destabilization and overthrowing of regimes to get oil and gems and whatnot, especially out of Congo. So the conflicts are caused here. The folks affected are here. And then they say, okay, well, things are bad here, let's go there. And we say, no, 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 we're scared. How does that make any sense? Now let's look at the numbers for today. I'm going to pull it up. I'm gonna go most recent year, most recent value from the highest to lowest. So Iran has swollen from about a million, 6 years ago, to almost 4 million people today. Almost 4 million. The highest number of refugees in the world is currently hosted not anywhere in the West, but in Iran. So good on you, Iran. Now, are they treating them well? Not necessarily. Do people in the West treat them well? Certainly no. This is not a question of who is treating the refugees the best. This is the question of who has the most. Turkey still has basically just as many. That number has barely changed. Jordan has swollen because of the ongoing destruction and genocide in Palestine. People had to flee for their lives, and where did they go? They went to Jordan, amongst other places, if they could get out at all. Germany still holding down the fort for Europe, so good on them. Spot number 4. Proud of you, Germany. Keep up the good work. Gaza, pretty much everyone that lives in Gaza is a refugee because of the fact that they were shoved there um, in a various number of occupations and ongoing kind of expansion of occupations. And this number is unfortunately decreasing because the people are either dying or being shoved elsewhere in many cases. Pakistan, again, US invasion of Afghanistan. Uganda still holding the fort really nicely for what they were doing before. Lebanon, the number has swollen just a little bit, again, because of the conflicts in Palestine and in Syria. Russia has actually swollen recently. Chad, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Poland, okay, our second European country, good job. Sudan, France, third European country, Syria, internally displaced persons because of the war, Kenya, Congo. This number was used to be almost 3 million, but most of the people have left because the war has gotten extremely intense. Cameroon, and then you finally have the UK and the US with about 400,000 each. 400,000. Population of the US is 300 million. Population of Germany is about 80 to 85 million, and they take 2.5 million folks. Population of Lebanon is even smaller. They take 1 million folks. They take almost 3 times as many as us. So when I show these numbers, I don't show these numbers to be like, oh, the US needs to be taking more, though they do. They do, in fact, need to be taking more. But I show them to demonstrate that the fear that is played up in politics and policy of the waves of migration that are coming is not accurate. The folks are not here. They are not coming here. I mean, many are, but they are not currently here. And so the fears that are stoked of, there's so many refugees, and there are so many refugees all over the world, and they deserve a good home. They deserve a place to live that a decent standard of living and whatnot. But the idea of like waves and waves are coming and whatnot is kind of ludicrous. We are not even close to the highest number. We're not especially close to the highest number based on land area. We're not even close to the highest number based on population, and so on and so forth. We could absorb significantly more numbers of people without it affecting the society basically at all. And yet we have such an intense, intense fear. That should strike us. Where does that fear come from? Should we believe in it? Why is it the case? Let's use a case study. Famous basketball player Giannis Antetokounmpo was himself technically a stateless person and a refugee. His family fled from Nigeria to Greece. They applied under all kinds of refugee policies that Greece had to try to get papers. They didn't get papers, and so Yanis was born not as a Greek citizen and not as a Nigerian citizen, but as a nowhere citizen, as a stateless person. Why is that? Well, Greece does not have birthright citizenship like we do in the US. So you have to be from a Greek family, a family who has Greek citizenship to get Greek citizenship. And to get Nigerian citizenship, he would have had to go back to Nigeria, which means he probably wouldn't be able to get back into Greece. And so he couldn't get that either. So he was born and raised, without any kind of citizenship to anywhere whatsoever. Um, as a result of the fact that his parents were not citizens of Greece, it was difficult for them at times to have sufficient work and pay and whatnot for their family. And so the kids, Ioannis and his brothers, had to make a living as, the hawkers that sell water bottles and sunglasses and whatever to tourists when they're going to see the Parthenon and whatnot. Um, and at the end of the day, they consign themselves to the fact that, okay, yeah, as 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, that's just what we have to do to survive. Now, of course, Giannis is the lucky one. He became like such a good prospect for basketball that the Greek government decided that, this person's good enough, let's give him citizenship and, by extension, his family citizenship, so that he will play basketball for Greece and in the Greek league and whatnot. And from there, he was able to come to NBA and become multiple-time MVP and NBA champion and all of that. But he comes from a background that is scary to be a citizen of nowhere because all the things that come with citizenship, the legal protection, the ability to work, the ability to own property in many countries, and so on, are directly tied to citizenship. And then if you get deported because you're not a citizen of the country and you don't technically have legal ability to stay, where do you go? He's not a citizen of Nigeria, so Nigeria has no obligation to take him back, even if his family is originally from Nigeria. So what happens to him and his brothers if they don't become Greek citizens? These are really interesting questions to ask, and this problem of statelessness is not very uncommon. There are many, many, many tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to potentially millions of folks. It is hard to track a number like that because obviously, if you're stateless, you're not going to wear a big badge most of the time that says "I'm stateless, come look at me," because again, you don't have those protections. But it exists and is quite complicated and difficult to navigate. Should he be sanctioned because of the fact that his parents went to Greece as refugees? Should he not be allowed to stay in Greece? Now he's an icon of Greece and is one of the most famous Greek citizens, in the world. But he wouldn't have been if they had just deported him when he was 7 years old, which they could have. These are all legitimate questions. And this brings us to that question of legality of immigration. So most of the time, when this issue is brought up in the realm of kind of American politics, it is brought up through the binary of there are legal immigrations and there are illegal immigrations. And that binary, first off, there is a whole question of like, can a person be illegal and the political correctness of that phrasing and versus undocumented and whatnot. Certainly that is a whole separate thing, but that binary itself distorts the capital D discourse of immigration so thoroughly that it's unrecognizable from any kind of view from the policy point of view. So when we want to talk about legality, whether migration is legal or illegal, let's look to some of the basic international laws on these things that the US is party to. The US helped write, the US signed on and is legally bound to enforce, which are it is illegal under international law to deny refugees, mistreat them, or prevent their integration into society. These are some of the things that refugees are, by the UN conventions, allowed to have, which are life, safety, justice, education, nationality within your country, and the right to seek asylum from harms. In other words, to say to a refugee, you can't come in here and become eventually a resident and citizen of the US is completely illegal under international law. The way that it gets done, though, is that most countries that are party to this, UN convention say that we get to decide whether, because the definition of refugee is based on well-founded fear, right? We get to decide whether your fear is well-founded or not. And if we don't think it's well-founded enough, you have to go right back to that fear. So if there's a hurricane that's destroyed your whole house and whatnot, and now everyone in the village is, drowned in water and starving, and you manage to come here, we get to decide whether you should be afraid of that situation or not, and whether, you're actually in distress and get to come in the country. And so the idea becomes that you only get refugee status and protection when the receiving country's government says you do, which is a gross perversion of the idea of the UN Convention. But it is the practice, the policy that is used to this day, even if the politics say otherwise. In other words, politicians can say a lot how they want to, accept all the people who are being heard or whatnot, and they care so much and their prayers are with them. But they are by the day determining who is and isn't allowed to come inside. And routinely, because at the end of the day, there is that fear of migration, and so people don't want to be seen as letting too many people in. Refugee determining offices are amongst the most underfunded, amongst the most understaffed, so it takes tens to 20s to 30 years to get your application processed. And the whole time that that doesn't happen, you're living in a camp, pending, waiting, not knowing, and those camps are amongst the most horrid places on the planet with barely any running water, if any at all, barely any power, if any at all, no kind of social systems, schools and hospitals and whatnot, barely any ability to work and therefore provide for yourself and have any kind of living or decent kind of dignity, barely anything in the way of safety, or privacy, barely anything in the way of health. So diseases are rampant in these camps that should not be rampant and are easily avoidable, such as malaria and typhus and whatnot. Um, it is just a travesty. And these camps exist all over the world. And they're technically completely illegal under international law. Because the right to life, the right to safety, the right to justice, the right to education, the right to nationality, all violated by sticking people in camps. But because the definition by policy is outsourced to the country to define, people can get away with it. And that's not just something that we do. Everywhere that accepts refugees does this. But that doesn't make it right. Just saying it is what it is doesn't make it good. Objectively, it is wrong and illegal, but that is not a neutral statement. Similar, there is some reason to say that the United States has a significantly greater responsibility compared to the rest of the world as far as accepting refugees, simply because many of the conflicts causing the refugees to leave when they're from war or famine, or whatnot, are because of direct interventions by American foreign policy. So what this map shows here is in dark green countries where we actively overthrew or changed their government by force, and in light green places where we interfered with the changing of the government, not necessarily through direct military or intelligence intervention, but in cases like Japan, where we wrote their constitution for them and told them this is how you're going to govern yourselves, and so on and so forth. Um, that's a hell of a lot of the planet right there. And we can see some of the major conflicts that are producing a lot of the refugees: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo, the whole Central America, most of South America, and even, North Africa and parts of Europe. Most of the refugees in the world today come from here, 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 and here. Oh, and here. Sorry, Haiti. So if we and these interventions in most cases cause the conflicts and the instability that made them have to leave. So maybe we do have an outsized responsibility to take a little bit more than what would be our share, and we're unlikely to be taking our share at this time, as the slide here probably demonstrates. So let's look at those policies though from the UNHCR, like in their whole. So we see, of course, the core principles of the convention. We see here the basic definition that we use. We see all the kind of aspects of their policy. So this is directly from the UN and from the um, international laws, again, that we are bound to follow. Here's the definition that I found. And what rights do refugees have under that convention? Again, rights that we are also obligated to observe. The right to not be expelled except under certain strictly defined conditions. In other words, if you like stab someone to death, they can kick you out. Let me tell you this, most people who are expelled as refugees and sent back to their home country didn't stab someone to death. They're just kind of denied access because, you know, they shouldn't be so afraid. There's definitely some gaslighting vibes there. The right not to be punished for irregular entry into the territory of a contracting state. So if you're a refugee and you enter irregular as a synonym for quote unquote illegal, you cannot be punished. As long as you're a refugee, in other words, as long as you have a well-founded fear of, you know, being persecuted or whatnot in your home country, and you have to enter the US illegally, they are not allowed to punish you in any way, shape, or form for that entry, including deportation and expulsion. You have the right to not be discriminated against. Last I checked, sticking people in camps while waiting to process their paperwork is probably considered a good form of discrimination. The right to decent work. There is no decent work in camps, violated. The right to housing, land, and property, including intellectual property. There is no housing, land, or property in camps, violated. The right to education. There's no education in refugee camps, violated. The right to freedom of religion. Sure, you have freedom of religion in what mosque, church, temple, etc. in your camp, violated. The right to access to justice. Justice also includes, as it says in the US Constitution, amongst others around the world, speedy due diligence and trial and whatnot. Takes 10 years or more to get your paperwork filed, not speedy or, you know, anything, violated. The right to freedom of movement within the territory. Once you get to the US, you're confined to the camp. No freedom of movement, violated. The right to be issued civil identity and travel documents after 10 to 15 years, not speedy or on time, violated. The right to social protection. There's very little social protection as far as kind of law or protection or anything like that within camps, violated. Um, and so therefore pretty much every one of these, even though we are legally bound to follow them, is violated. And most folks that come here in quote unquote undocumented situations can easily count by this definition. Easily. And yet we talk about trying to expel them. We try to talk about punishing them for irregular entry and so on. We are not legally allowed to do so. But yet we find creative means to do so anyway. This is why I put legality in quotes, is on the one hand, we talk about, well, according to US law, but a higher law exists, which we agree to, we wrote. So legality becomes just a really tricky lens. And this is why I say it's such a distorted binary to say, oh, well, you know, whether it's illegal or not in the US context, blah, 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 just kind of doesn't make sense. Because under international law, it means something totally different. And we conveniently ignore that part within kind of the capital D discourse at home. And that brings us to that idea of undocumented migration. At the end of the day, migration is a constant. People move. And enforcement of borders is the human created portion of that. Now, I will ask you, pause the video again when you think about this question. Which president in the United States amnestied? So amnesty is giving citizenship to those folks who came here undocumentedly after they'd been here for 20 years. Which president in the history of the United States amnestied the most undocumented folks? And I'll give you a hint. It was 1970 and on. So, you know, Nixon to today. It's not going to be like, you know, Abraham Lincoln or something. Just think about it. Again, it'd be nice to have the call and response. I would guess that the majority of folks would say either Obama, Biden, or Clinton, and every single one of those would be incorrect. The answer would be Ronald Reagan. That doesn't mean he's a saint. That doesn't mean he was soft on immigration, but it's the difference between politics and policy. Reagan was, in fact, the first Republican to be really making immigration a big part of his campaign, that he was going to be hard on immigration and he was going to, let less people in and so on. And he did do that. He implemented what's called an immigration freeze, where folks who came here legitimately, legally, through the correct channels and with a visa and whatnot. Again, if we use the UN definition, anyone who's a refugee is here legally. There's nothing we can do about it. I use that terminology knowing that it's distorted, but because it's the terminology that they use. But the freeze on folks who are applying for citizenship, naturalization through the conventional process and told them all, nope, you're going to have to wait a bunch of time. Why? Because we're scared of you. But okay, but I came here and did all the right things. Yeah, it doesn't matter. So yes, he succeeded in being hard on immigration, but he did amnesty the largest number of undocumented folks in the history of the United States. Reminder, amnesty is you came here as an undocumented person, you're here for a long time, and the government says when they do amnesty, hey, actually, all of you who've been here 20 plus years, screw it, you've been here long enough, you're just American now, we'll give you citizenship. The irony is, for that whole time that you've been here as an undocumented person, you are deathly afraid of any interaction with the state whatsoever so that you don't get found out and deported. Because they will. It's very hard to find a job. It's very hard to go to school. It's very hard to get a house or an apartment because all of those require, having identity documents from the state. And if you don't, and people find out, they can deport you. It's very easy to be exploited in your job because the boss usually knows you're undocumented, can abuse you, and then if you try to go complain, they'll say, well, then we report you to ICE and you're going to get deported, so shut up and work. So you're spending the whole time going through all this difficulty and abuse and trying to evade the state. And then after 20 years, the state says, yeah, actually, it's chill. And not only that, prove to us as a condition of your amnesty that you were in fact here for 20 years. But what paper trail is there going to be when in fact you're spending the whole time trying to make sure there's as little paper trail as possible? So the whole thing is very ironic. And it's such a bizarre way to do things where it's like, okay, no, 3 million people amnesty, go, like Reagan did. As opposed to just giving them the rights in the first place to make them more able to contribute to society at the end of the day. And then you have all the immigration freezes. So I have a friend, for example. His name is Henry. We went to high school together. I met him when he was 11 years old. He came here from Korea when he was 7. He applied through all the conventional means and got his visa and wanted his citizenship and whatnot. Guess when he got it? So he came here, he was 7 years old in 2004. Guess when he actually got his citizenship? Just, take a guess. Well, because 2004 was during the post 9/11 immigration freeze, he had to wait until 2016 to get his citizenship. 12 years. And he did everything, quote unquote, right, everything correctly, everything through the normal means. Still took 12 years. Because simply the government said we are not doing immigration right now because 9/11 made people scared. And so what's the easiest thing to do is to say we're not going to, naturalize new citizens. That's what this dip is right here. And this dip or this rise is when Obama first came into office, and then it kind of crashes again, and so on. It is very much a tool of politics based on fear and fear mongering, or kind of emotional pity points when the Democrats give a bunch of people citizenship and whatnot, because notice that it surges and then it crashes again as soon as the election season is over. And then it rises again when election season comes back. It is a football that the politics uses that affects people's lives. And that's the difference between politics and policy. Notice again that People talk about Donald Trump and the border wall and the immigration freeze and all of that. The thing is, Joe Biden built and expanded the wall more significantly than Trump ever did, even though he's a Democratic administration. It just isn't talked about as much. But those administrations do just as much in the same. At the end of the day, the fear-mongering process is born from the logic of carcerality that we talked about last time. It's born of the idea of certain acts are bad and therefore should be punished, and the creation of the idea of coming here, quote unquote, illegally, according to laws that are illegal under international law in many cases, and that they should then be punished for those. The punishment itself also being illegal under international law. So when we think about the question of who is legal and who is not, it does very little for us to understand the actual nature of why people are coming here. Why are they coming here? Well, because there's wars in their country that we started, or there's starvation because of the war 30 years ago that killed a bunch of people and, blood soaked the land. Or there's, natural disasters from climate change that, our Humvees and Hummers and, Europe's crazy like muscle cars and Ferraris and whatever are causing. Okay. So should we get to punish them? Why? It doesn't really make much sense. And then, of course, there's the question of the economic contribution. And at the end of the day, there is no good scholarly evidence anywhere that says that immigration takes jobs out of the supply. Always the way that capitalism works is it's ever expanding. The more people there are, the more of every type of job you need to support those people. So if more immigrants come in, and then you need more teachers to go to school for those immigrants. You need more people to work at the coffee shop to serve those people. You need more coffee shops. You need more, grocery stores. You need all the more things to supply for more people. So there will inevitably be more jobs as long as there are more people, because that is the way that the system works, is it sustains itself ever expanding. So the idea of a finite number of jobs that certain people are coming in and taking is basically ludicrous. Then you have the idea of, well, what about taxes? Well, here's some graphs. Here is the amount of money that undocumented folks pay estimatedly to the US government today in this blue. 3 billion with a B dollars for the state of California in 1 year, based on their tax money. Undocumented folks in California could buy the Clippers and have a little money left over. Texas, 1.5 billion. New York, over 1 billion. Illinois, about 1 billion, and so on and so forth. That's a hell of a lot of money. And if you legalized all those folks today and gave them US citizenship and whatnot, the actual marginal difference in taxation is very small. In other words, the majority of their share and contribution to society is being done now for a government that actively wants to deport them and end their presence here, and therefore cut that 3 billion with a B dollars that they're getting. It doesn't make any sense. Further, what this graph doesn't capture is that when you're an undocumented person, you don't have the ability to work certain jobs simply because you need identity documents to do so. And so this number would actually go much higher for folks that were legalized, quote unquote, years later, because you could work whatever job you want instead of having to settle for under the table, really questionable jobs where the boss is gonna, abuse you and whatnot because they can threaten to deport you. I will tell you another story about another friend of mine whose name I will not disclose on an online recording, who is an undocumented person, ironically also from Korea. I went to college with this person, known him for a long time, and he is a recipient of the program called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was implemented under President Obama to basically make it that if you came here undocumentedly as a kid, they will not deport you, and you can access social services like school and whatnot, and university, and have like a work permit and such and such. Okay, he's been on DACA since 2014. It's 2024. There's no path to citizenship, green card, or anything from DACA, though. So he remains undocumented. And if DACA is ever removed, the tension is that DACA requires you to go to the state and say, I was a child who was undocumented. Now, obviously, he's an adult, he's my age. Um, and therefore is revealed to the state with address and everything that he's undocumented. So if DACA gets repealed the next day, ICE, sorry, Mr. So-and-so, you're actually going to get deported. Obviously, it's worth the risk to be able to go to school and work and whatnot, but it's terrifying. So is DACA a good policy? Certainly in the sense of it helps folks like him who as a child you didn't have a choice where you came or where you went. Your parents kind of made that decision for you. It's not like you were, as a 3-year-old, like, hey, actually, let's not go to America, because I don't want to get deported later. But also it's incomplete. At that point, shouldn't there be an amnesty provision or something like that? If Reagan can do it, why couldn't Obama? It's a legitimate question. But for him, what made this whole thing fascinating is as an undocumented person, everyone talks about, that they're taking our jobs and they're doing this and they're doing that and they're not hardworking and whatever. And it's drivel. The capital D discourse is mostly drivel. This is a person who worked 3 jobs while attending UC Berkeley full time, taking 16 to 20 semester units every semester, working 1 job to pay his own bills, 1 job to pay his parents' bills because they couldn't work good jobs because they didn't have DACA. So they didn't have a work permit. And then working a 3rd job as an RA to pay his housing. Plus being, that 16 to 20 units, semester units every semester. So when we say the contributions that this person made are negative somehow, is absolutely nonsensical. Not only are all those jobs paying taxes to a government that, again, actively wants to deport him, he's paying his income tax every year. Not only is all the money being spent on sales tax going straight to the government, and not only are a number of people that as an RA he helped with their adjustment process to Berkeley being affected directly positively by his presence. Not only are all the people, that he assisted through the legal clinic that he worked at being helped with whatever legal situations that they were being assisted in directly positively by his presence, but all of that benefit is going to a country that actively wishes him harm. And that's really the twisted reality of the framing of the question through the question of legality and legal or illegal and so on. It misses the mark by so much and really kind of distorts the way that we understand the concept to begin with, which is people are here, people are coming. Why are they coming? How do we navigate that? And what do we need to do to keep society running and well and help people integrate so that they're not treated to racism and indecency and stuck in refugee camps and so on and so forth. So what all of that touches on is these kind of big buzzword things that people talk about when it comes to migration and its economy. Again, political and economy, the politics of who gets to come in, the policies that, enforce those politics, and then the economic ramifications of them. We saw from the previous slide that folks that come here from other countries, documented, undocumented, whatever, have major contributions to the taxation, which the government then uses to fund itself, to the labor force, to our population in general. So important thing here is like most expensive countries on the planet, the US, Korea, Japan, Germany, Norway, blah, 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 population growth is collapsing. Like the populations are actually just cratering. Why? Because it's too expensive to have kids. You need to get a job if you're going to have kids, which means people are having kids later, which means people are having less kids if they're having kids at all. Whether you should have kids or not, separate question. We don't have to get into that here. I have my own beliefs on there. That's, a whole separate thing. But the fact of the matter is that our populations are shrinking. There are less kids than there are parents, except for the fact that there's immigration. So in other words, it's not, even if you want to say that there's finite resources, which capitalism doesn't actually say, as I said, because the more people there are, the more jobs you need to sustain for those people and so on. But even if you want to say, okay, there's only 5 jobs, well, there's less people. The only reason that there's even a kind of chance for us to not end up like Japan with like 40% of the country being over 65 or whatever is because of immigration. And trust me, that is a terrible thing for the economy when that many people are over 65, because someone needs to pay for all that healthcare. Someone needs to provide for that healthcare. Otherwise, everything goes to hell, and Japan is really struggling with that right now, as is a lot of Western Europe. But they don't have immigration. We do. And that helps. So we should be grateful, probably. And then, of course, you have all the folks coming here with professional degrees. You have all the folks coming here with knowledge that we don't have, with skills we don't have, and so on. If we really believe in that idea of, going all the way back, land of immigrants, the best people can come to do their job. We will all get along together. It's going to be great, the kumbaya. How do we get from there to here to here? That part of it is actually true. If that vision was implemented, the economy would be better. There is no doubt about that in any scholarly sense. But it is not. And even under the way that we have, 40% of all the food that you eat is grown by folks who are undocumented. In fact, more than that, because a lot of the food comes from other countries, but 44% of all the food you eat that is grown in the US is made by folks who are undocumented, who are probably brutally exploited to grow it. You will see in the Braceros program the ways in which the agriculture industry depends on immigration. Now, that was not a story of undocumented migration, though it conflated heavily, and we'll get into that shortly. But it's critical. And also, at the end of the day, how many of you alls are going to be going out into the fields to pick strawberries? So are you really competing for the same jobs? If there was even a competition to begin with. Because at the end of the day, you're going to need more strawberry pickers, the more people that there are, because people are going to want more strawberries. And then forget the fact that, as soon as any of us transfer to Cal State or UC or whatnot, foreign students pay 3 to 4 times more money to those unis to basically make it so that they can subsidize um, our tuition, or so they say. They have enough money to give it to it just for significantly less, but let's pretend that they're as broke as they say, which they're not. But we don't have to get into university economics today, but simply that, people come here and pay that money to be here and then are treated, so terribly. That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, these folks are not refugees, so they're not subject to, these protections and whatnot, but still, meaningful contribution to society, meaningful contribution to society, meaningful contribution to society and economy. Let's talk about a couple cases and then we'll close. First one, restaurants. So why are there so many diaspora restaurants? Well, one may think that, oh, well, it's just like good food or whatever. No, there is a very clear political reason for it, in fact. And that is that when the Chinese Exclusion Act hit, folks from East Asia were not allowed to get visas to come here. Now, the way that those patterns of migration usually work, and many of you who family recently immigrated might know this very well. is usually, especially at that time, because gender roles were very patriarchal and still can be in many senses. The male of the family in a cishet relationship comes here, works for a little while, saves up some money, and eventually pays for one at a time or two at a time the partner and the kids to come over. But then when the Chinese Exclusion Act hit, all the people that were here making the money to bring their families over got stuck because now the partners couldn't get visas. Done. It was excluded. You're done. It's over. The same with the Japanese and the other Asian folks who the CAA hit. Except if you were a business owner. That was the only exception to the process. And that's an exception that is on the books today, where if you're a business owner, your immigration paperwork gets processed much faster. To this day. And so restaurants was one of the easiest forms of businesses to make because you needed a little small space. Most people knew how to cook something at the end of the day. You didn't have to go learn a whole bunch of crazy other skills. You just like make some food for people. And then you have a business. And suddenly that's like the only ways you can get visas. And so families would get together and make ethnic restaurants and invent dishes that were kind of westernized versions of their local cuisine. So that's where we get dishes like orange chicken, like beef and broccoli, chicken tikka masala. Later, when Vietnamese folks were trying to use that same expedited for business owner policy after the Vietnam War, banh mi. Nowadays, as Middle Eastern folks and Turkish and whatnot are coming, bob stands in New York. That's where we get all of these from, is that idea of owning a business gets your paperwork done faster. Politics, policy, economics. And it was really intense, the ways that they had to do it. So basically, the way that they would do it is, okay, no one person usually had the money to buy enough space for a restaurant, even a small one. So you would get like 10 dudes who all are trying to bring their families over and have them pool money together to buy a property so that you could own the restaurant. And then one person would become the like owner of the restaurant and everyone else would be an employee. And then you would basically take no money as the employee other than what you need to live because they're going to pool all of that so that they can send for their family faster. So you're going to let them pocket a bunch of money and then they're going to send for their family and do the paperwork as the owner of the business and then hand the business off to the next person in the conveyor belt and then they're going to do it for a few years. So you're going to kind of work as an exploited laborer for years to help out your bro so that it'll come to you so that you can bring your family. That's how arcane it had to get because of the idea of just legal restrictions that are racist. Hey, we don't want Chinese people here. So, and that's how we get orange chicken. That's how we get beef and broccoli. The reason that's beef and broccoli is because the broccoli in the quote unquote original dish from the mainland was supposed to be what they call Chinese broccoli or gailan, which has like this asparagus type texture and taste to it. But you can't get that here back then. So they used the next best thing, which was broccoli. And so you got beef and broccoli. But these are the levels of stretching you had to go through to navigate an immigration regime and actually get your family here when you came here and did everything quote unquote correctly. Forget those who, came here as refugees and are told actually you shouldn't be so afraid, go back. But at least we have orange chicken because of it, so hey. And then lastly, you're going to have your movie on the Braceros program, which will be a whole separate process for you to look at. And the Braceros program is extremely historically significant as far as the ways in which Latin American migration is considered and looked at to this day. It is basically the foundational policy that set up the entire way that migration from that part of the world is looked at. And from there, in many ways, it characterized the capital D discourse around immigration as a whole. So the braceros were, and I will say, watch the movie for most of the context. I'm going to speed run through it here because this is already getting quite long. But the braceros were guest workers. In other words, a contract was signed between the U.S. and Mexico would send us people to us to work, and they would sign a contract that says we're going to come here for 5 years or 10 years or whatever, and we're going to work and we're going to go back. And then the US promised that if you send the people, we will give them fair pay, good living conditions, and housing, and all of that for the time that they're here, and then they're going to go back because after all, they're guests. You're going to treat guests well. Well, does that look like good living conditions? These kinds of bunk beds with 12, 15, 20 people in one bedroom? No, not really. But that was the living condition for most of the braceros. Does fair pay sound like well below minimum wage and, in very harsh conditions, growing crops and whatnot in the sun? Not really. Does having your passport revoked and your ability to travel outside of the compound, by your employer for the duration of your stay sound like good living conditions? Okay, not really. What about being unable to contact home or visit home during your off time or any kind of vacation or anything like that? Basically being kind of forced to stay within the compound. Okay, not really. We talk a lot of shit about the kafala system in Qatar and Dubai and whatnot, especially around the World Cup 2 years ago. And that is one of the most horrific labor regimes that has ever existed. Don't get me wrong. The Braceros program is almost identical to that system in every way, shape, and form. Now, of course, the Braceros program was, 50, 60 years ago. Unfortunately, things are not necessarily different or better for a lot of undocumented folks today, but because they're undocumented, we don't see it so much. So program residents often resided in camps. You got the little sarcastic kind of intro from me. They were separated from their families for 10, 15, 20 years, whatever the length of their contract was. They were treated so badly in the US. The number of lynchings in Texas was so bad that the Mexican government had to ban the US from sending their workers for Texas for fear for their lives. Let me say that again. So many braceros were lynched in Texas that the Mexican government had to say, you cannot, America, send braceros to Texas anymore because we, the Mexican government, fear for our citizens' lives and safety. At the end of the day, the Braceros program was thought to bring about 5 million folks into the US to do work. Many of them integrated somewhat and then were about to go back. But the significant increase in folks from Mexico coming to the US, as it always does, sparks what I said at the beginning is the core of the immigration question, which is fear. And so, rather than thank the guests for doing the labor that needed to be done to feed the country during World War II and in the labor shortages because everyone's off at war and so on. No. The US instead implemented what is called Operation This Thing, which is a racial slur, which is why it is crossed out and I will not say it, but this thing. Which was a policy of mass deportations of folks from Mexico, including most of the braceros. So, hey, come here for, 10 years. We're going to promise you good pay, good living conditions. We're not going to give you that. And then instead of letting you go back on your own power, we're going to deport you. And when we deport you, it's going to look like this. When we asked you to come here to begin with, now we don't want you here, so get out. And many of the folks who were deported during this operation were naturalized American citizens of Mexican ancestry. Still deported. Did they get due process? No. Were they asked whether they were citizens or not? No. Did they get a fair trial? No. Any other protections that come with being a citizen? No. And of course, the very fact that the term is what it is, this is a racial slur on the level of other racial slurs that we know for other groups, just proves the malice behind the whole thing. So we ask you to come here as a guest. We mistreat you. under something equivalent to one of the most horrific labor regimes that we've ever seen. We lynch so many of you that your government fears for your life, and then we deport all of you when you're done, as well as some of the other people who look like you that are our own citizens. So when we talk about the question of legal or illegal, most of this wasn't legal. Most of this wasn't legal. The people who came here quite legally. We still deported them. But it characterized and paved the way to have a fear of, millions of people from Mexico are coming, they say. And that was a fact. They conveniently left out the fact that we asked them to come to stoke the fear to then deport them. It was a game of politics and policy, policy that affected people's lives for legitimacy. After World War II, you just fought a war. You gotta like celebrate something, so we're gonna go be racist to people and kick them out of our country to celebrate how cool we are. Because, when you're in a war, you're already kind of fearful of foreigners or whatever. So it's easy to be like, yeah, the foreigners are coming. See, they're so bad. But legality, illegality, all of these things have very little to do with anything in this space. And that becomes the real ways in which this conversation just gets twisted around on its head. It's political because of all these aspects that we've talked about, because law touches all of it, because politics touches the reasons why people moved in the first place. The reason why many of you whose families immigrated here, all of our families came here except for those who are native folks, not to erase the settler colonial project, remember. But the reasons that our families came here was mostly because of war, famine, disaster, persecution, or economic opportunity. It's one of the four, or five, I guess, in that case. All of those are political. The war is political. The famine is political. The natural disaster and ability to rebuild is political. Economic opportunity, why there's opportunity here and not in your home, political, and so on. Persecution is definitely political. So this is why it's in the political economy section. There's very clear economic aspects. All these people doing labor, very economic. All the restaurants, very economic. Why are they having to do this kind of economic behavior? Well, because of the politics, because of the policy. The politics lead to a exclusionary policy, lead to these restaurants. The politics lead to racist policy, leads to the entire discourse around folks coming from Latin America changing. We're going to see more of this next week when we talk about changing demographics and we talk about the last big dimension of political economy, which is land. And so that's going to be your final kind of unit for the course. But in the meantime, I know this has been a lot. Take a deep breath. The materials for this week are purposefully lighter as far as, being videos and whatnot instead of a bunch of readings. Or if they are readings, they're, short and quick readings, just so that you have a little bit of a break because these lectures have been a lot. And so I thank you for being patient with that. I do hope you learned something, that you are practicing that discernment that is so key. And I'll see you next time. Take care of yourselves.